Whenever you walk up to a Pro 2 compact, the first thing you should do is set the console preferences. If you use one before, you'll probably have your preferences stored on a USB key. If not, navigate to the preferences screen using the fast access buttons, and then by navigating these tabs with the mouse, you can set the console up to behave in a way that you're comfortable with. So firstly, the configuration of the system. This console typically will be its own master clock. However, you can set it to slave to an external clock. So if you're using the console as an extender for a Pro 3, Pro 6, Pro 9 or XL8, you can slave this system to an external clock by choosing one of the AES50 ports to be the clock source, or an AES3 clock source, or a word clock source. The next two options you have is setting up how the foot switches operate. There's a foot switch socket on the back, which you can program the console to perform two different functions, either step to the next scene, or you can have the foot switch operate the tap tempo on the effects rack. Same again for foot switch number 2. You can control the fan speed of the console, so if you're working in an auditorium where you want very low ambient noise levels, you can run the fan speed at slow to keep the ambient noise levels within control. The option here is only relevant if you're using the DL431 mic splitters as your I/O box option. So this tells you whether to use the digital A splits or the digital B splits. The next switch sets the date and time of the console's internal clock. We'd like you to keep this up to date if possible, because if ever you're sending log files to us for analysis, it's very useful if we know the exact time and date of any events. The next option is the A or B inputs. Now, each channel on the mixer actually has two inputs. We've chosen to call them primary input and tape return. But the tape return input is actually just a second input into the channel, so it is possible to connect two sets of I/O hardware to the console at the same time and then flip between those two I/O options using the switch on the console there. You would also use that for virtual sound check, playback from an external hard disk recorder. A couple of shortcut buttons just to enable and disable all of the tape returns, and just resetting the default settings for the console. Moving on to the show preferences. So the first thing to do is to choose how you're going to use your available outboard DSP. You can choose how many effects and how many graphic EQs you need. We've got anything between 6 effects and 8 graphic EQs up to 1 effect and 28 graphic EQs. But do remember that all of the output buses have 6-band parametric EQ on them by default. The bottom checkbox turns on the console's automated patching. The default for this is to be unchecked, but if you want the console's output patching to become part of the snapshot automation, just tick that checkbox. Maybe we should do with the magnifying screen. Can't get prescription screens on our consoles, unfortunately, so I'm going to have to put my glasses on. Right. We're now looking at the user preferences. So these are setting up some of the basic behavior of the console to the way that you prefer. So we have display rotary values, which turns on the console's ability to give you numerical readouts for any controls which you're touching. Fast zone delay control means that you can remap the assignable controls to be an input delay as well as an input gain. Select follow solo means that anything that you solo on the console will also be selected. So in other words, it'll pop up on the screen. Automate paging turns on the console's ability to remember what the surface looked like when you stored the snapshot. So if you store a snapshot with a certain group of faders on the surface, every time you recall that snapshot, the console will give you that fader group. So if you have a song which opens up with a piano, an acoustic guitar and a vocal, you could create a population group with those members, store the snapshot with that group on the surface. So every time you recall that song, the console straight away gives you the input channels that you need to deal with as the song opens. Fader Touch navigation of detail area turns on the touch sensing of the input strip. So that can be quite useful in that the console then gives you visual support for the area that you're touching. Some people find that irritating, so it is possible to turn that option off. Send pan follows channel pan allows you to slave the pan controls of any stereo aux sends to the channel pan. So anything that you pan left or right in the stereo mix will also follow in any auxiliary mixes. The Use Global Tap as Global Meters Pre turns the global tap delay button into a global pre-fade metering button. Flash global tap continuously. If that is checked, then the tap tempo for the internal delays will be permanently flashing on that button. Again, some people find that irritating, so the default is that the button will flash for 3 or 4 times after you've left it alone. Hide unassigned channels when flipped is the console's ability to just present me with the relevant input channels when I select an output. So if I select my snare reverb when I'm in flip mode, the console will then just give me the channels which are contributing to the snare reverb. If I deselect that box, then the console will present me with all of the input channels. This is some of the navigation modes. So if you're new to the console and unsure of some of the advanced navigation features, you can actually disable those advanced features in the preferences here. Overlay stereo pairs. If I have any pairs of inputs configured as a stereo pair, when I populate the faders with stereo channels, I can ask the console to just present that as a single fader instead of giving me 2 channels. Name list allows me to edit the presets for input names, so I can use my own combination of uppercase, lowercase and keyboard symbols, and then select those from the drop down lists on the naming page. And finally at the bottom here, this tick box says that any input or output channels which are in hardware safe mode will have their parameters stored to a snapshot. If that tick box is deselected, any input or output channels which are in hardware safe will now not have their settings stored to a snapshot. Default for that is to be checked.